I will pass it over to Thorsten, who is our International Liaison Officer for Germany.
Yes, hello and welcome to today's Globe Talk on the World Social Work Day in 2022. My name is Thorsten Bakschik, joining you from Germany. The topic of this year's World Social Work Day is co-building a new eco-social world, leaving no one behind. The World Social Work Day is celebrated across the world, and the theme presents a vision and an action plan to create new global values, policies, and practices for trust, security, and confidence for all, and for the sustainability for the planet. In today's Globe Talk, I'm very happy to introduce you to a global collaboration between Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena and two SRH universities in Germany, based in Heidelberg and in Dresden. Next slide, please. And we will, that's the agenda, and we'll basically dive right into two presentations with the theme of tackling the digital divide, presented by Ute Kahle from Dresden and presented by Cassandra and Camille Huggins from Pacific Oaks College. And the second part we'll have today is about the provision of social care services for persons with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Our speakers are Dr. Ute Kahle. Professor Kahle is the study program director for social work at the Dresden School of Management, which is the campus of the SRH Berlin University of Applied Sciences in Germany. And Ute has a wide range of research focusing on inclusion and participation, as well as effects of digitalization on social work. The next speaker is Dr. Camille Huggins, and she's core faculty at the Department of Social Work at Pacific Oaks and has a background of clinical social work and sociology. Then we have Dr. Cassandra, who is also core faculty at Pacific Oaks in the School of Cultural and Family Psychology. The list of research is very long and ranges from socio-emotional support systems for healthcare workers to COVID-19 long haulers. Then we have more speakers from Germany. That's Katharina Kärgel. She's a research associate at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Law at the SRH University of Applied Sciences in beautiful Heidelberg. And her fields of research include sexualized violence, group processes, research ethics, just to name a few. And then last but not least, we have Sigrid. She focuses on employment and social policies, labor market monitoring, and the migration of skilled labor, among other topics. And I will hand back the mic to Nancy Garcia now. Thank you.
Thank you, Thorsten. I just want to let everyone know that this session is brought to you by TCS Global Engagement. TCS Education System, as well as its affiliates, are committed to preparing innovative, engaged, and purposeful agents of change who serve our global community. Our team works to bring this mission to life by providing leadership, infrastructure, as well as support for the internalization throughout the TCS community. Our Globe Talk series is part of this mission and provides virtual year-round discussions to introduce our community to thought leaders in higher ed, experts on key functional areas, best practices, and the diversity of thought necessary to expand our internal strategic thinking. I just want to give a few tips before we begin. We ask that you please mute yourself throughout the presentation. There will be time for a question and answer at the end, but please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat box. As the speakers are presenting, we will be monitoring this chat box, so please feel free to add any questions as you see fit. We also do request your patience. Technology can be a bit challenging, but we will do our absolute best. And if there is any issues, this talk is being recorded and it will be available after the session. Now, without further ado, we will begin our first talk with Dr. Kahle. 1 second, as we will be switching the screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Bakschik and Nancy. Nancy is so kind to support me by having the slides. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to start with a little bit different title. I would like to discuss the question social services on digital markets does social work need to be digital? Yeah, referring to the topic inclusion, participation, and disability in times of assistive technology and digitalization. Thank you for the next slide, Nancy. Yes, I would like to give you a short overview. I will discuss in the introduction definition of acting, professional, and social work, areas of so-called conflicts, exercises for inclusive education, curative education, and transformations for social work. And in advance, I would give some short introduction to trend lines, trends within digitalization, and challenges which refer to these trends. I will, tell you something about best practice, about research module, which I'm going to challenge. And afterwards, I will give short perspectives, and then we have probably time to discuss questions and answers at the end of all presentations. Yes, introduction. We can show the next slide, please. Acting professionally in the context of digitalization, what does it mean? Acting professionally in inclusive education, curative education, social work refer to the discussion within profession through Alice Salomon, founder of the first social female school in 1910 in Berlin in Germany. Inclusive education, curative education, and social work has been educated until 1970 in vocational schools, and colleagues in Germany. From that time on, social work education was transformed to universities and other high schools. Yes, is inclusive education, curative education, and social work a job or a profession? Or we can have another question: can one learn social work? May I have the next slide, please? Acting professional means mostly the way and method how different elements of knowledge like experts, didactics, pedagogic, diagnostic, practical experience in learn and educational processes can be taught in a way that professional acting arises. Acting professional is knowledge-based and value-based in the context of institutions. Challenges which result, exactly, thank you very much, Nancy. Challenges which result in the context of discussion about social work and digitalization are, for example, professionalism and voluntariness, standardization and casework, theory and practice, scientific research-oriented work and professional practical work, expert of social work and expertise in reference sciences, for which topic and fields are professional social worker experts. Yes, I will give another idea on the next slide. Media education and design of cultural changes for experts and clients. How can we use digital media meaningful in order to improve and expand social services? Online consulting, for example, services and their ethical challenges, for example, the accessibility is here very relevant. Social space work against the background of a timeless and dislocated logic. The social work needs, in addition, answers referring phenomena like online mobbing, online stress, excessive using of media, sexting, classical media education, children and youth protection, computer plays, pornography, or cyber grooming. These are examples for new phenomena. On the society level, questions has to be answered as the following: how to shape the public opinion in the World Wide Web? racism and discrimination. New fields and topics can be developed through e-sport, for example. Other fields and topics change or they slip. Digitalization is also accompanied with a wide range of changes in the social work. I will come to some trend lines referring social work and digitalization. Which phenomena do we have? Common calendar, Google Maps, instant messaging, smartphone, common companions of everyday life. These shapes are already casual. Digitalization has different meanings when I like to define the word or the phenomenon. The term focuses on the digital transformation and presentation or implementation from information and communication, but also digital modification of instruments, devices, or vehicles. It seems also to be a historical change for mankind after the Industrial Revolution. Yes, so we can read it in a Caritas publication a few years ago. Trends within digitalization. The term is not easy to define. And in addition, the process of digitalization and transformation seems to be kind of abstract. It's not only about hardware and software, even the interaction of technology, society, and individuum. A socio-political term, digitalization means the change which occur through digital technologies between computer, internet, robotics, artificial intelligence, which drives forward every living sector like education and work, free time, the shaping of social relationships, consumption behavior, mobility, and so on. Digitalization has fundamental influence with its digital tools. New options for participation and self-determination could be made. Some other trend lines are digitalization is no fashion. It's an ongoing and extensive process of digital transformation and means everything which could be digitalized will be digitalized, like network, share, then own, data and automatization, person-centered, changes in working world, changes also in communication, acceleration, hybridization of social spaces. In addition, we can focus on networking, on networks. There we have the phenomenon location independent access to communication, data very well available through clouds, participation in society, telemedicine, online counseling, and better networking. I would like to come to a phenomenon share then own, because we have a kind of sharing economy, community consumption through shared usage of goods, sharing knowledge through Wikipedia, for example. Sharing enables effective consumption like cars or bikes or e-bikes. Through networking activities, resources can be used which have never been used together before. Not everything will get better through sharing. Sharing means that the way who earns money is changing and refers to a new shape of capitalism, for example, Airbnb, hotels, and hospitality. Resources can be used more effective, but they change the economic cycle also. If we have a look on the person-centered phenomenon, one can say modern product developments analyze problems and needs of target groups. Consumer-oriented developments are based on methods like interview, storyboards, and so on. On the base of evaluation, new offers are individualized and perfect. Which challenges could be mastered referring digitalization and social work? We have the phenomenon that we have a closeness and relevance by everyday life. For example, how does digitalization in everyday life form client accord? Which relevance has it? Referring decentralization and regionalization, we can see the visit of complex and specialized organization forces people to interrupt or cancel their everyday contacts. Virtual rooms can be created in a way that they are accessible for these clients. Referring prevention, we can see that through anonymity of digital services, dangerous situations of fears of stigmatization can be minimized even more than in face-to-face settings. Which other challenges do occur? Referring integration and inclusion, we can see that digital inclusion and inclusive digitalization are leading to many new options. Referring participation, we can see that the roots of digitalization are basically democratic. On the other hand, digitalization is a kind of covered commercialization. Through influencer, for example, support digitalization to colonization of living environment. Clients can more and more participate and support social services to develop into corresponding organizations. Yes, please, the next slide. The main business of social work, what is the main business of social work, is ambivalent regarding digitalization. We have a technophobic sector, we say. Professionals have a generation conflict with digital natives, on media socialization, and on the attitude that social work only can be done face-to-face. But the clients won't already use digital devices, media-oriented young people, people who are disabled because of their health constitution, elder people, also people with disabilities, and people who live, for example, in economical underdeveloped regions. All of them could profit from digitalization. I will come shortly to best practice, haben teilen in German, and you can translate it and share what you have. This is a special concept which comes from, it's a care concept which we adapt in my research into the disability studies. Scientific research studies show that implementation of the kinesthetic concept affects less pain, reduces the length of the patient's stay, improves functional skills, and increases the independence of people with high movement restrictions. As active mobilization has been shown to help maintain functional abilities, more approaches to active mobilization are needed. The effects of are that participants will be enabled to co-create their motion instead being moved passively. The move from passive to active mobilization, the concept of kinesthetics may help. Although there are evidence-based studies referring to the positive effects of kinesthetics, people in need of long-term care were not supported in increasing their movement competences like they could. The background of my research is the kinesthetic concept to implement it into an organization which works with people with disabilities. And this concept exists since 1980s. and was researched by American researchers. They offered movement courses for dancers, parents, and children. Since 2006, kinesthetics has been organized in a European network also, with national organizations, and this organization is called European Network Association. And the concept was found in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, and Romania, and currently implemented in Japan and also in Denmark. Let me come shortly to causes and effects of this method. Kinesthetic is an educational and supportive method of stimulating and training patients' movement and their own contribution to mobilization. It improves the functional skills and increases their self-efficacy and independence. It strengthens also the patient's movement competences and provides them with the opportunity to play a more active role in their own handling process or prevent and retard degeneration. Kinesthetics has, in addition, the effect that supporters of people in need of care and disabled people perceive themselves more mindful, and this effect refers to the aim to maintain their health. I come to a third picture. It's a kinesthetic trainer with a client. Research studies, however, show that the implementation of kinesthetics leads to enormous improvements. And Lange-Richman, for example, could determine effects in the fields of health insurance, rehabilitation, and participation, and as well in care insurance. Yes, we can see the next slide, please, Nancy. Factors which influence the implementation of kinesthetics were examined. And I come to the next slide again. The consolidated framework for implementation research is a model which focuses on influencing factors and in addition, a structure-given frame for another actual research study. Yeah, the next slide, Nancy, thank you very much. The research strategy and design is, the research project is guided from the question which affect the provision, the implementation, and the application of digital platform for supporting the mobilization for disabled people with restrictions in personal, social, pedagogic, and economic regard will have. Yes, it's a qualitative, explorative, longitudinal study with 9 qualitative interviews with participating observations, 2 survey times, one at the beginning and one after 1.5 years. And the participants are people with disabilities and limited movements competences. Supporting staff like nursing assistants, social care workers, voluntary and workers, and other people. Yes, and the adaptation is to create an app, an application, which goes digital and support these people. I will shortly come to some perspectives at the end of my presentation. What does digitalization and social work mean for participants? Adequacy and effectiveness of digital applications can be more efficient if employed, and affected people could be part of the development. Referring professionalization, we can say, upgrade of many professionals through digitalization, and simple support work as a perspective for people who are under other circumstances unable to work. And another point is that changing work conditions into a digitalized shape is necessary. Power control, occupational safety, work and health protection can be realized with digital tools. For example, mobile devices enable better work planning and gapless control. The appropriate and legally justified working relations has to be the aim at this topic. Two other perspectives at the end of my presentation: preventing of rising dissolution risk, for example, and thinking new about education and qualification. At the same time, there is no qualifying strategy for the social economy now. It is clear that knowledge for the use of digital and technical tools has to be improved, and there's more need for curriculum work in this field, of course. And I would like to invite the audience to a free conference which starts in this week on the 17th and 18th of March, and it's called Digital Media, Educational Media, Digitalization and Inclusion. Yes, and refers exactly to the competences which we need in social work. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kahle. If you have any questions, please go ahead and write them in the chat box now. But for now, I will be handing over the screen to Dr. Huggins and Dr. Peel.
Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and get our presentation on the shared screen. One moment, please. Okay, Dr. Huggins, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Dr. Peel, and Dr. Huggins is also here today to discuss bridging the gap between equity and digitalization through social work. And we'll go ahead and just briefly introduce ourselves, starting with Dr. Huggins.
My name is Dr. Huggins. I am located in New York City. I'm core faculty at Pacific Oaks College, and I am happy to be here. My research interest has been on vulnerability and trauma and resilience amongst people of color.
Thank you, Dr. Huggins. And I'm Dr. Peel, and I'm also a core faculty at Pacific Oaks College in the social work program and the master's program. And I'm based in Tucson, Arizona. I know we have people from all around the globe today, so that's very exciting. My background is in medical and healthcare social work, and also with the intersections of disability, chronic disease, aging, and grief. So we'll go ahead and dive right into our presentation. So with the advent of the pandemic and an ever-evolving social landscape, both the social work profession and social work education has moved online. This has implications for the various generations of faculty, for students, and for practitioners in the field. Adapting to an online format when we've worked in the field for so many years has been an adjustment, and we find ourselves serving in a sense as translators to students who are learning in a new modality. They're learning in hybrid models with both their field education and their online asynchronous learning here at Pacific Oaks. And we're going to focus today on discussing the phenomenon of what's called the digital divide, its impact, equity issues, the mechanisms of online education from a US perspective, and also the transformation of how the social work profession is taught, supervised, and practiced. Next slide.
So, I want to just congratulate and compliment Professor Util Kahle and her presentation about digitalization and how it's being used in innovative ways. But yet and still many people in the world do not have access to digital technology. We have, the digital technology is excellent in fighting against poverty. It is a fantastic opportunity for economic growth as far as e-development, e-commerce, as well as e-education. But there's a stark reality about the readiness of people being ready, meaning do they have access to proper infrastructure in their communities to access Wi-Fi? Do they have computer systems and all the technological apparatuses that you need? Usually nowadays, if you don't have an iPhone, an iPad, an iWatch, an iComputer, you're not with it, you're not in it. But 21 million people still do not have internet connection in the United States. Nearly 40% of African Americans living in rural America have no internet access at all. 3 in 10, 27% that live in rural communities, as well as 2% that live in cities do not have access to an internet connection. 44% of adults who income is below $30,000 do not have broadband connection. And 41% of adults with an income below do not have a desktop or a laptop. Unbelievable in this day and age, but very much a reality for most. Education-wise, 40% of the schools do not have adequate broadband. So schools don't have internet structure in their schools. 35% of lower income households with children do not have broadband connection at home. And 17% of the students are unable to complete their homework due to limited access. Prior to the pandemic, many people were going to the local McDonald's, the local stores to get their Wi-Fi to access, or the library. When the pandemic happened and they had to close the libraries and they had to limit their access to the McDonald's or the local school restaurants, they could not go and do their work. 50% of low-income families of color do not have the technology required. And that's very stark considering where we need to go as far as digital technology, what it can do for everyone. Next slide, please. When we look at digital disparities, we're looking at the fact that the National Center for Educational Statistics, which is a federal think tank who basically computates all the statistics on education, primary, secondary, as well as higher education in the United States, they say 27% of American Indians do not have access to the internet, or they may have dial-up, which, as we all know, is a very long way to engage. 19% of African Americans do not have access to any kind of broadband or any kind of Wi-Fi connection. 17% of Latinx. Latinx is a term that is used to cover those of Hispanic descent, Latin, South America, Central America, the Caribbean peoples. We have 12% of Pacific Islanders, which are basically those who live in the small islands of Indonesia and in the Southeast Asia area. We have 7% with those who have 2 or more races, don't have access to Wi-Fi, and 7% whites and Asian, and 3% of Asians don't have access to Wi-Fi. So, you know, when you accumulate all these statistics, it's a wide range of people who still don't have access to digital technology as well as Wi-Fi information. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? What is the overall impact of the digital divide? It means low performance. We are trying to, you know, Social Work Month is, we're trying to include everyone, but we're still not accessing everyone, or everyone does not have access to what should be universal at this time. You know, so low income families still have less access to information. And in the world of facts and truth and falsehoods that is permeate all over the world at this time, that makes people make up their own truths. And that can also be very detrimental. The competitive edge of a society is based on the fact that those who have the advancements, who are able to participate in technology in the digital age, is very important. So those who do not participate also loses the edge for the country as a whole. The convenience of learning. We are all multitasking. Since we've been in the pandemic, people have different jobs, people have to access things. The convenience of learning is something that we've really embraced worldwide in every kind of way to basically teach our children as well as ourselves. and different learning experiences. You know, one thing about being online is that people of different learning capacities have access to education for the first time. So those with differently abled, those who have chronic illnesses but want to still engage in education have access. But if we don't have access to broadband or the technical apparatuses, this also impacts them as well. Next slide, please. Now, how does this ferry out in education is something that some of us may ask. Statistically speaking, in the United States, 12%, let me just say all African-American, Latinx, and Native American indigenous people, they make up 45% of the undergraduate students in the United States, and 32% of the graduate student in the United States. But when we ferry it out amongst the different races, among African Americans, which make up about 12% of our US population, 56% of high schoolers will attend college. They will go to some sort of 2-year degree college or a technical college or an undergrad degree, but only 12% will earn an associate degree and 9.4% will earn a bachelor's degree. So although they enter schools, they do not stay. And that's very stark and that's very alarming. 10% will get a master's degree, 6.5% will get a professional degree, which means a lawyer or a doctor, and 7.6% will get a Ph.D. Amongst the Latinx population, which is about 18% of our overall population, 70% will enroll in some sort of school, but only 18% will receive an associate's degree, or 11% will receive, earn a bachelor's degree, which is also very alarming as we look at these statistics. As far as master's degree, on par with African Americans, 7.4% will get a master's degree, 6.9% will get a professional degree, and 4.9% will earn a doctoral degree. When it comes to Native Americans, they can constitute of 7.7% of our population. So 18% may go to, and they are also very much impacted by the fact that they do not have broadband and Wi-Fi connections in their communities. So that is why some of them are not attending school as well as they could. But 18% will go on, graduate and go to college, and 32%, which is better than the other populations, will earn an associate's degree as well as a bachelor's degree. Next slide, please. You want to go first?
So in terms of the learning and living online equity issues, I'll talk about the second portion of the slide, which is really focuses on, in light of COVID, what students have had to face and the kind of setbacks that they've had to overcome. They've had to deal with economic struggles, with job loss, with housing insecurity, lack of ability to have consistent internet and appropriate tools to be online, as Dr. Huggins just outlined and discussed. Health issues, right? So loss of good health. Many of our students were actually diagnosed with COVID, and some are still long haulers with contending issues from the virus still. So that's an ongoing issue. Mental health, I don't know where I can even start with students in terms of the isolation that has been felt in this period, the grief, the loss, the sadness, also the uncertainty about the future and their profession, and also what that looks like, including their educational experience and their ability to be supervised on site. Relationships morphing with different issues and transformations and changes, big life decisions. And finally, they've contended with life plans. Either what I have found is either being put on hold or now being escalated, depending on the timing, because people feel that time is a very strange concept now. But it's not a normal time. It hasn't been a normal time for the students. And so that's the portion of the slide that I really wanted to focus on in terms of, what we found as faculty has been setting students back.
So as you may not know, worldwide that we are, Pacific Oaks is a Hispanic serving institution. So that means that 25% of our student population are of Latinx descent. And because of that, we have tried to be incredibly inclusive. We are in a social work program, one of the first in Pacific Oaks to be online, fully online. And what that means, Pacific Oaks is a small college in California. It's very, very familiar. Everyone's very close. The students feel very much included. And what we had to do is basically transfer this work environment, this very calm and familiar and very inclusive and supportive environment online. Now, how did we do that? We basically looked and made sure that parent support services were very much involved. We looked at the concept of servantness, which meant that we had to basically anticipate all types of social support issues that students may need. We had to constantly spend meetings every week with students to keep them engaged and keep them very much involved in their commitment to school. The great thing about being online is that you can do things at your convenience. Another bad thing, the setback, is that sometimes you forget because childcare, work, family obligations take precedence. And so you may forget your assignment. We had to digitally reach out to all of our students at some point in time to make sure they know, hey, you still are in your master's program, you're still in your bachelor's program. So therefore we transformed our role as professors. Next slide, please.
Absolutely. And to Dr. Huggins' point, there's been a lot of different elements of online education that have shifted in this time. And one of the things that we also wanted to discuss is that in the United States, social work is a licensed profession. It requires credentials. It requires, Dr. Huggins was mentioning this yesterday, it's a 2-year program that is a rigorous master's degree that involves, it's very labor intensive, to use her words. You have to physically be on site to train. And depending upon your setting, there could be great peril at times even, because you're serving really vulnerable communities. So it's very physical, usually, and it's a highly regulated profession. We will talk more about this in the Q&A. We hope at the very end of the Globe Talk to learn about the comparisons between how social work programs are built and designed. But we'd like to, just to talk a little bit about how in every state holds its regulations for professional licensure in social work here in the United States. And so that's our signature. There's also, in our program, most of our students are first-generation students who are returning students. They've worked for many decades. They're what we would call in the States non-traditional students. And so the average age of students in our program is close to 40. Many of our students are female, and they are caregiving for either young children or parents and older generations. So we'll segue in a moment to talk a little bit more about how the program has changed, how the profession has changed, how the way that we train people has changed for the profession, and in hopes to help them respond to the times because this profession is needed now more than ever.
We've also had to change our pedagogy as far as thinking about the non-traditional student and what they are capable of doing. In social work, your heart could be in it. You can have great intentions, but school is a different story. You have to have certain skill sets that are not something that you engage in often. Writing, for instance. Many of our students, English is their second language, and writing in English, you're writing for technical, writing for reports and running the writing formats are very difficult for some students to understand. And we have to basically tailor our assessments of their growth educationally to meet their needs, and understanding culturally what is available to us, and to make sure that we can see that they're understanding what their material that they're learning, but as well as to help engage. So we spend a lot of time as a Hispanic serving institution thinking about innovative ways of teaching, of thinking. Dr. Peel and myself created a lot of our courses. So therefore our courses had to really meet the needs of our students to make sure that they were fully engaged. Because another thing is to keep students engaged. we are a competitive society. So there's a lot of online schools. So how do we stand out? How do we make ourselves unique is something that we have to really think about when designing courses and engaging with students. Next slide, please.
Absolutely. And there's been a huge increase in telehealth visits alone starting in 2020, 154%. And that kind of gives you a window into the shifting times and the changing of the profession. And 63% of students committed to a program that was virtual because it aligned with their work responsibilities. And as we know, telehealth has multiple benefits during the pandemic and beyond by expanding access to care, reducing disease exposure for all involved staff and patients, et cetera, and students, preserving scarce supplies when they were scarce, and also reducing patient demand on facilities, right? That's changed the way that we even think about structure and facilities. And so the students have also started to notice that their internships that are telehealth providers, these changes might continue to support increased care access even after the pandemic. So these are real-time societal shifts that students are realizing. And students aren't the only ones that have gone through changes. 60% of higher education staff reported an increased workload online in the profession. And talking a little bit about, go ahead, Dr. Huggins.
No, I was saying, even for social work positions, they have gone online, and preparing students to how to read and work with clients online has been the new challenge. We're always looking at the new normal, and the new normal is that we'll have to prepare students to work online, to work with clients. How do you pick up indicators? How do you help clients? How do you know if they're lying to you? How do you know how you can engage? How do you know if they're really following up? These are the things that we have to now translate that was done in person online, because even though the pandemic might be over, people don't want to go back to face. So we have to be able to pivot in that way to make sure that they are understanding what's happening and how to adjust.
And to Dr. Huggins' point, I'm glad you made this point, because there are some generational gaps with this, right? So you might have some students that have so much experience with soft skills and interacting in person, but then you also might have a cohort of younger students that are digital natives as opposed to digital immigrants who've lived a hybrid life. Like most of our faculty have lived a hybrid life before computers and iPhones dominated the way that we live. But also our newer students, our younger students, that were born into that world already. So how to also we negotiate this intergenerational education of social workers, and they each have a very specific and special skill set to bring to the table, and that should be recognized. Both the successful. We'll talk a little bit about being remote in the field and how do you learn in an applied setting virtually, and that's what our program has had to do for the 2 years that it's been in existence. So we would say that the successful response of a school of social work to the pandemic has really relied on field programs to work in partnership with agencies to reimagine, essentially, and reoperationalize new models of training and teaching and learning. And the reality of these times has resulted in the creation of placement experiences for students in which they're being engaged in practice without the immediacy and the availability of direct consultation and supervision at all times. And that's, our experience of COVID and how it's impacted professional training, because our program is a professional training program. It offers a lot of lessons for us, and that would be how to use, if you have utility and effectiveness with our programming, how to have curricular and structural flexibility. And Dr. Huggins touched on this. We've had to rebuild certain courses to make them more relevant and modernized, forward thinking. And those have been challenges that we've worked through. And also the value of intensive collaboration in response to the crisis, including our accreditors who have just granted us candidacy.
So how does this work with transforming social work education? We've had to pivot, it basically being the only first online program in our school with recruitment, with retention, being forward thinking in our curriculum. We had to kind of think about, when COVID basically hit, it happened about April 2020, right? My father died first month, right? We didn't understand what this was all about. I knew that I couldn't take any time to grieve because all of my students were also in crisis. I had to make sure that they were, so many students said I couldn't do this assignment because I had COVID, someone passed away. We had to become counselors. We had to have a trauma-informed teaching approach. We had to kind of think about, not making sure that deadlines were met, which is what teachers kind of do, into making sure that we met with them and try to work around the students' needs, as well as helping them graduate. I remember sending out emails to my students saying, listen, I understand, class is ending soon. What assignments can you do? When can you make sure the assignments are in? I would sometimes even say, you're a good student. You can get an A, but right now you're kind of teetering on a B. What do you want to do? Do you want to try to push for the A? I had to do a tremendous amount of encouragement. So I was the counselor slash, teacher in a lot of ways. So, we had to kind of look at the fact, and some of our students were on the front line. And we had to also be respectful of that they were on the front line. They were living it while they were working, going to school at the same time. That's a unique position to be in as an educator, because now we have to get their lived experience existence in what is happening in education wise. So both of us had to go back and forth in how we worked with our students. I know Dr. Peel used to meet with a student every week who needed a tremendous amount of encouragement. Because while online, the statistics say that Latinx students don't do it successfully because they need the person in person, the online curriculum works best for them because of the multiple roles that they have to fulfill. So we have to always think about encouraging them and making sure that they don't feel left away or left out in any sort of way. So transforming social work education has to be very personable in its approach, trauma-focused, and very student-centered. Dr. Peel?
That's a perfect segue, Dr. Huggins, into discussing faculty multiple roles in this time. So the pandemic has really impacted the evolution of faculty identity as we used to know it, as it relates to the design and the facilitation of our teaching and learning practices, being culturally relevant in our technology, and also highlighting the inequities within the digital divide. So although the demand for online education during the pandemic has increased, innovation in technology is far ahead of corresponding changes in inclusive pedagogy. We've had to do work with regard to academic advising, mental health support, curricular design, also being very much involved in the student retention conversation, because as a sector, and this is across the board, not unique to any one institution, enrollment will be down in periods of crisis, right? And so therefore, as a fledgling program, it was very daunting for us to face that additional obstacle, being already new and seeking that candidacy. So as we were building this program, we were realizing that we had to create a very unique identity for ourselves, but also understanding that we had suddenly all of these new identities that we had to reckon with to be able to support each other as colleagues who we've never actually met in person, and also students who are also living across the country, and having these identity shifts to also being institutional cultural influencers and putting a stamp on our program, having an identity for this program and being part of that process. So it's been a very exciting process as well whenever you have a brand new program, because we've had the creativity and there's no rule book. We've been able to build this program, and I think build it during a stressful time, but perhaps the perfect time, because also we are building this program in response to 21st century crises, such as biohazards that we're dealing with, political instability that we're dealing with, social unrest that we're dealing with, all social problems that, whether it is around the globe, it directly impacts the social work that our practitioners are doing with their clients, whether it's direct or indirect. We're all really interconnected in these times.
We've all, a great point of making that we have been grief counselors. Did you talk about the grief counseling? Dr. Bill and myself, we've done ed talks on grief counseling, the importance of basically working with it. We are also working with the local secondary and primary school district in our community, basically on grief. Parents dealing with the fact that they've had to stay home for a year, the guilt, the grief of deaths, the grief, the stress that they were under. So we have basically tried to package what we have done as in our role as a lecturer in our schools, but then transferring it into community impact. And I think that that is one of the better things that we have done as far as our multiple roles. It is amazing what you can do online. It's amazing who you can reach. We are really discovering who we can reach and how we can basically help and support those who don't have anybody else for help.
And I think to your point, Dr. Huggins, this time has also motivated faculty to do service, and service can be done virtually. It could be done creatively. We also did a session that was led by Dr. Huggins with childcare providers. And to me, it was earlier in the pandemic. It was late 2020. And it was so critical because so many of them felt really isolated, and the responsibility of having to take care of multiple children not vaccinated. At the time, nobody had access to vaccines. It was a dangerous time, but also the staff, the shame of having to, if you tested positive, everybody had to know because you had to leave. And therefore, they talked a lot about stigma with the diagnosis, even though many people have gotten COVID, and there's really no reason to feel like you have stigma or shame because it's millions of people have gotten it. So it's a contagious virus. But to hear the childcare workers, the frontline workers, we were able to provide some support coming from the outside, where sometimes people feel more comfortable with an outside, group coming in. And so that's just another example of us crossing sectors, because that's another special part of our profession, is that we've been able to go into schools, go into early childhood education, work in healthcare. It's pretty limitless. Our profession is one of the most versatile, and that is something else that we constantly tell students, that they can evolve and grow with the profession as they want. They don't have to have one track for the rest of their lives in the practice of social work.
Well said.
So with that, we will wrap up our presentation, and we have a couple of questions that we will pose during the panel, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts about some of those questions later on. Thank you, Dr. Huggins.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I will now hand it over to Ms. Kärgel and Ms. Rand. You can go ahead and begin showing your screen when you are ready.
Yes, now you can hear me as well. Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity to give a talk at this great event, offering so many different insights on topics that are very timely and extremely important. And I'm glad that there are several overlappings in the work that I have been doing in the past years, and the kind of topics that you are looking into. So the presentation that Katharina Kärgel and I are giving today is based on studies that were commissioned by the European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disabilities in 2020 to 2021. EASPD is a Brussels-based advocacy organization that brings together service providers from European member states and non-European countries. And they range from small service providers offering specialized services like support for labor market inclusion at one end of the spectrum, and organizations running large residential facilities at the other end. To start with, it was important for the EASPD to acquire a good understanding of how the framework conditions changed for service providers during the COVID-19 pandemic and how they impacted the scope, quality, and reliability of social support services. So at the beginning, the focus was on the whole social services sector, which in itself is extremely diverse. And in the follow-up studies, the focus shifted to specific questions such as the recovery of the workforce in the sector, digitalization of services, and employment of persons with disabilities. The research term used a standardized study design ranging from a literature review and compilation of statistics to 49 semi-narrative interviews with different organizations. We talked to representatives of service providers and workers, professional associations and administrative bodies in an aim to understand the challenges that the sector was facing at the outbreak of the pandemic. In the studies, Spain, Germany, Finland, Romania, and Ireland were in the focus of research, and the selection of countries was complemented by 5 additional countries in another study. In our selection of countries, we tried to cover different models of social welfare states in Europe. The range of countries that we had in the sample, of course, added to the demanding task of identifying common developments and challenges in these different countries. But it was fascinating to see that indeed there were significant commonalities and overlappings despite all these different settings. And I'm glad that we can share this with you today. So already very early in the pandemic, we saw that emergency laws and legal decrees determined the conditions under which services could be provided and allocated decision-making powers and responsibilities to different administrative bodies. The decisions affected, first of all, the organizational and financial operating conditions for the providers of services. It's the green sphere. The way that services were organized and available, the pink sphere, and the way that they could deploy their workforce, denoted by the lilac sphere. These fields appeared early on in the interviews, and we were expecting them to come up. But what was even more interesting were examples on how the changing conditions at the overlapping of these different fields led to reconsidering the way how services were provided or scrutinizing the general principles of service provision that had so far been taken as a given, because changing the taken path is always associated with costs and uncertainty, sometimes for a reason, sometimes as an excuse. So in the graph, this area of overlapping is marked through the arrow. So this is the area where discussions about changing this perspective on services for persons with disabilities was reconsidered, where new ideas came up and new experiments came up for providing these services. I will briefly go first of all through these different multicolored fields before I come to this main message of my presentation. When we look at the providers of social support services, especially daycare centers and childhood workshops, experience the closure of their premises first. They were the first ones to experience the outbreak of the pandemic, and the consequences of that. Also, the inclusion services were discontinued, as was the case for job intermediaries. That is, organizations supporting people, persons with disabilities in finding a job in the regular labor market. They had to develop alternative services, for example, for those involved in workplace-related trainings. Staff planning was considered extremely difficult under the pandemic circumstances by all kinds of providers, as these providers were trying to redeploy staff to cover changing service needs or compensate for the higher levels of sick leave. The situation of uncertainty and work overload was extremely burdensome for the staff. In addition, there was an increased need to coordinate the activities with authorities and other service providers, as well as communicate with the families. In many cases, providers found themselves ill-prepared in terms of their ICT infrastructure and skills for such new and intensive forms of communication, or realized that the users of their services and or their families were missing the necessary equipment and skills. As I already mentioned, the social service workforce stood under a lot of pressure as they had to perform additional tasks for which they were not trained or did not have time. This involves developing hygiene concepts, acquiring personal protective equipment, developing and reinforcing hygiene rules. Also, coordination and communication activities were very extensive. In addition, they experienced changes to their workplace environment and daily routines if they were redeployed to a different work setting or a different employer even. There were cases where the authorities or employers cancelled their workers' right to annual leave, or even quarantined them in residential homes together with the residents for several weeks, or in their own homes so that they wouldn't catch COVID-19 and would be available for their 2-week shift. This was the case in Romania, for example. In many cases, this resulted in a discrepancy between the professional self-understanding of staff. So there was a discrepancy between the work environment and requirements that they experienced and the kind of service they would have wanted to offer. And the kind of service they were able to offer under the circumstances of COVID-19. So we have a situation here where the service providers are under a lot of pressure to cut their services or find alternative ways how to provide them in order to keep things running. And similarly, there is a significant additional burden on the workforce providing these services. This results in the first step in increased protection and separation measures, which has a significant detrimental impact on the autonomy and dignity of persons with disabilities. Furthermore, their daily routines and social ties were significantly disrupted and could only to some extent be replaced by online communication. In several countries, there was a situation where the income of those persons with disabilities whose employment did not take place in the regular labor market and regular employment system was significantly cut, since they were not eligible to short-term unemployment recompensation programs set up in most countries. This has to do with the fact that there are specialized employment settings such as sheltered workshops, and they do not adhere to the principles and forms of funding that there are for persons with disabilities in the regular labor market. So you see that the COVID-19 pandemic raised many fundamental questions on how services for persons with disabilities are provided and what the underlying principles of service provision were and still are in many cases. So in this situation where the existing routines and certainties were disrupted, the providers started considering how they can change and substitute their services so that they can cover the needs of persons with disabilities in the best possible way under these changed circumstances in this new setting. And the examples that we saw included things like, and I'm starting now from the smallest interventions or changes that were taken or planned. In situations where services had to be substituted, there were examples from Finland and Ireland, for example, where the workforce explored extensively what the alternative service needs of persons with disabilities would be. Also, most providers described how they intensified their communication with persons with disabilities and their families if they were in a setting where they needed support from their families. So the families were involved more strongly into the whole communication process, and the process itself was more intensive. As the workplace routines changed, service providers considered how this can be communicated to persons with disabilities and how they could be supported in setting up new routines or getting used to new tasks. Sometimes they were also assigned new tasks in either a different setting or in a different sector. In many cases, workplace-based learning was disrupted. It needed to be explored which learning patterns and formats would enable persons with disabilities to continue their learning processes. This was a development that took many providers by surprise, and they were, and I would say still are, not well prepared for that. This is something where further research would be needed to help providers understand the needs of persons with disabilities better, so that they can offer suitable learning formats. Also, the redeployment of staff enabled the workforce providing social support services to experience another side of everyday life of the persons they had been working with. This was the case when daycare staff were redeployed into residential settings, or even more so when social support staff changed from a sheltered workshop to a residential facility. They said that they could experience the persons they were working with in their residential setting, and this was very beneficial in understanding their needs and also their everyday life better. In countries where the employment of persons with disabilities in specific work settings like sheltered workshops meant that they were not eligible for recompensation on the same basis as those employed in the regular labor market, we had cases where both service providers, but also administrators and interest organizations voiced a clear need to reconsider the principles of employment and remuneration of persons with disabilities. So this meant that these disruptions made service providers seek a new perspective on the users of their services. Of course, a fresh perspective does not always mean that people are able to act on them. It needs to be taken into consideration that the resources available to the providers vary a lot. And this depends on, first of all, the general availability of funding in the social support sector. We have a situation where the opportunity structures in Finland and Romania are very different, and this determines if changes are possible or not. In Romania, these changes were rather took place at the level of individual organizations or individual social support workers even, who used their personal resources, while in Finland there is a good endowment of the social support sector, and a lot of changes that are necessary will be able to be funded. Also, secondly, the field of service providers and services is very large and diverse. And we need to consider that there are providers which offer specialized support services like labor market intermediation and inclusion services, or who are accompanying the daily lives of persons with disabilities employed in the regular labor market. It is easier to implement person and capacity centered offers, empowering persons with disabilities in these cases, changing the approaches in large residential settings, which in some countries still exist, is probably more difficult. And finally, there are many cases where there is a strong path dependency in the service provision for persons with disabilities, and any changes that would be taken would need to be systemic. This is, for example, the case for employment of persons with disabilities in sheltered workshops in Germany to a large extent. This is caused by the setup of social welfare funding schemes. It's very closely tied with these funding schemes. These funding schemes are very inflexible. They have been in place for a long time, and this makes it very difficult to make any changes and reconsider the principles that are at the foundation of this setting. Therefore, we need to go back to the field of research in a couple of years' time to see how far the developments and ideas that we observed now have really manifested themselves as services which cover better the needs of persons with disabilities. When doing this research, I always value very much the opinion and the advice of my colleague Katharina Kärgel. It's always extremely beneficial to talk to her about the findings and discuss with her. So I am very, very happy that Katharina is today commenting on this research that was carried out last year and this year.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Sigrid, for sharing these wonderful insights with us. And what we would like to do now is to critically comment on our own contribution. So to sum up, the research conducted on the impact of COVID-19 on the workforce in this very heterogeneous social care sector for persons with disabilities identified fields which will need to be addressed at the level of individual organizations and/or networks. For example, due to personnel shortage as well as changing work organization and tasks, the social care providers will need to adequately address the emotional well-being of their staff 2 years after the pandemic. This is all the more important because, to our knowledge, social work research asks the question of who helps the helpers not often enough, notably considering that services for people with disabilities are, sociologically speaking, a form of emotional labor. Besides, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the need for reskilling in the fields of communication and digital technologies, as well as infection protection and hygiene. Just here, maintaining and reinforcing cross-sectoral ties should also be considered. From a socio-political perspective, cross-sectoral ties promote the person-centered approach, which is gaining further importance in the provision of services to persons with disabilities, at least in Germany. With regard to person-centeredness, however, it is to be assumed that different ideas of how the support system for people with disabilities should be reformed and aligned with the objectives of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can all be brought together under this umbrella term. Critics in Germany claim that person-centeredness is institutionalized in political discourse and serves to legitimize the specific orientation of a legislative reform of integration systems. And so we would like to conclude with a critical remark that the mentioned chances for revising the approach to service provision for persons with disability, on the one hand, focus on staff in very, very different and diverse settings, and on the other hand, on the reorganization of services for people with disabilities. But the latter are addressed in this context primarily for needs analysis. The opportunities of their stronger participations are hardly considered. So, moreover, they are not placed in a reciprocal relationship to the professional self-image, self-understanding. We are critical of this. In our opinion, the way in which needs are identified and measured and services are reorganized reveals not only something about professional self-understanding, but also about the understanding of disability. And we would like to point out provocatively that the results presented here today may, in some respects, reflect a deficit-oriented medical pedagogical understanding of disability. And therefore, we suggest that the social and cultural understanding of disability, which is very common in disability studies, be applied in revising the approach to service provisions for people with disabilities. So when we're considering their needs and preferences under changed circumstances, such as the corona pandemic, the basic principle of the international disability movement, nothing about us without us, should apply. Last but not least, for bridging the gap between equity and digitalization through social work and co-building a new eco-social world, leaving no one behind. And in this sense, we say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I really want to sincerely thank all of the speakers today. We do have just a few minutes left for Q&A. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and write it in the chat box.
Are there any questions from Heidelberg? I see all the students far, far away in the beautiful tower building. Okun, are there any questions from the students maybe?
No questions from our side.
All right, it's late in Germany. It's late. It's a late global social work day, or World Social Work Day. All right.